Look, do what you want, but I highly recommend listening to this episode with headphones on because you just don't want to be too loud these days. Howdy, I'm Jeff Goldsmith, and this is the Q&A. My agenda is simple. Each week, I plan to bring you in-depth insights into the creative process of storytelling. And folks, now that your headphones are in, yep, we could talk freely. No death angels will get you. And I'm very pleased to report that today's guest is writer-director Michael Sarnoski to talk about A Quiet Place, Day One. You know, this was Michael's first studio film. Obviously, before this, he did Pig with Nicolas Cage. So this is a big leap for him. And it was a really fun interview in which we were able to go behind the scenes and find out how he rose to the challenge to make this great sequel. As always, the first part of our podcast is spoiler free. So if you haven't yet seen A Quiet Place Day One, go see it in theaters, but you could listen to the first half of the interview without even having seen the film. Michael was very forthcoming about his creative process and what it took to get this film made, so I know you'll dig this episode. And speaking of things to dig, I hope you check out Backstory Magazine. We just turned 12. That's right, we're a teenager. We're 12 years old. We're rambunctious. We're getting in your face. And you know what? We just published issue 52. So it's been a great summer so far, and I hope you'll join us. If you've never read Backstory before, you could read us on a desktop or laptop or via the iPad app Backstory. And there's a free issue waiting for you to read. And if you like what you see, and I hope that you do, you could save $5 by using discount coupon code SAVE5. That's SAVE and the number 5, and that will save you $5 off a 1-year subscription. Just enter that code in your shopping cart at backstory.net, and your login info will work both on our website and in our iPad app. As always, we're also updating the issue that we recently published with new articles as well. So there's always new things to read and new scripts to read in Backstory Magazine. So I hope you check it out. Look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where you could see all these Zoomcasts that we do. It would really mean a lot to me to have you join us as a subscriber. So thanks for considering. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right into our chat with writer-director Michael Sarnoski about his latest film, A Quiet Place, Day One. Michael, it's good to see you. How's it going, man?
It's going pretty well, man. How are you doing?
Good. Well, so basically, I want to give our listeners a touch point of who you are and from whence thou hails. Where are you from? Where'd you go to school? Did you study film?
I did not go to film school. I grew up in Wisconsin, felt very far away from the film industry there. It had always been kind of like a passion of mine, a hobby that I really loved, but I think it took me a long time to feel like I could potentially pursue it as a career. And yeah, I did the whole kind of classic, like went out to LA after college and was, kind of wandering around, helping friends out on their short films and not really sure what I was doing or what like career I was even pursuing in film. I knew I loved writing. I knew I loved editing. I didn't think I had the personality for directing. I thought you needed to be a little more bossy or something.
Right.
But directing kind of became the natural way of connecting writing and editing for me. And I sort of saw that all as like one long thing. And yeah, eventually, I made a movie called Pig. It took me a while to kind of get there. It was, I wandered through various different options. And then I ended up getting a manager after this like short documentary that I produced and edited. And then I wrote a couple scripts, just trying to find something as that first project, and Pig just kind of managed to sneak by. I wrote something that I intended to be really, really small. It was a really small movie, but Originally when I wrote it, it was like, let's do something that I could sort of do guerrilla style if I had to. And then it kind of expanded as Nick Cage became interested and all that.
What was the documentary?
Oh, it was a documentary. It was called The Testimony. It was directed by Vanessa Block, who worked with me on Pig as well. And it's about sexual violence in the Congo. It followed the largest rape tribunal up to that point in the Congo. And yeah, it was sort of like an overview of the history of sexual violence as a weapon of war, and then kind of a little bit of a portrait of how that trial went down. And it was kind of an incredible experience cutting that together, because Vanessa went over there, shot it, had like 250 hours of incredible footage. Wow. And it was about how do we turn this into like a half-hour documentary. And then it was a pretty weird experience cutting something in languages that I didn't speak, but it was kind of wonderful, and it was a great lesson in kind of how you can shape something and find these stories. And then it ended up getting like shortlisted for the Oscars, and that was kind of the first moment that there was any sort of attention from like the industry. And yeah, and it was through that I got a manager, who I'm still with, named Michael Diamond, who kind of took a shot and said, "Hey, if you have a script, I'll take it out to people." And yeah, Pig was that second script I kind of wrote. First one was maybe too dark and weird.
Well, give us
And
the
then,
pitch. What was your first script when you were starting?
well, the first one was, I think now this seems like a really been there, done that idea, but this was like, what was that, like 10 years ago? It was sort of like a very dark, contained, small superhero movie, essentially, about kind of the abuse going on at like a facility for talented youngsters. But it got like real dark. But at the time, I think now we're in an era of like The Boys and stuff like that, where we've kind of been steeped in that. But I think when I wrote it back then, it was like, I don't know if anyone's, I mean, that was the general response, was like this is, no one wants like dark, weird superhero stuff. Like this is supposed to be like fun stuff. And so then I wrote Pig, and yeah, and then it kind of just that sort of happened. I mean, not
what was the title of
happened,
the superhero one?
I think it was called It's Normal.
Could it ever be something you would dust off?
I don't know. Maybe I'll go back and give it a read and see. I mean, I loved it. Like I loved the characters and what it was kind of exploring. Like the kind of superhero-y element was like very much in the background, and it was much more of kind of like a drama about, you know, youths struggling with growing up and finding their kind of place in the world. But yeah, maybe I haven't read it in a long time, but maybe I'll crack it open. I love writing. I think there's some directors that I think kind of write because they have to, like, so that they can make something, and you know, it's just part of the process. I actually really enjoy just writing, even if I'm not going to make it. Like I've written a couple scripts where I needed to get them out there, write them, feel good about them, and then I'll decide, you know what, I don't really want to direct this. So I'm sort of okay being like, well, that was a good experience. I'm glad I wrote that. It has merit. But I don't need to feel like it needs to get made for it to have like meaning to me.
So would you let other people direct it if somebody came in that was interested in one of your scripts?
Yeah, no, I would. I think I would have a harder time directing something someone else wrote, but I would be fine having someone direct something I wrote. You know, I definitely write pretty specifically for how I plan to shoot stuff and edit stuff. But yeah, I would definitely write something for someone else to direct.
That's cool. I mean, let's talk about your habit for a second. When you sit down to write, how important is outlining to your process?
It's important later on in the process. When I first sit down to write, usually the first thing that comes is like a character and a vibe. Like usually there's like some kind of image and some kind of feeling that it conjures for me, and then a character and kind of what they're going through and what their struggle is. And then the kind of story world and the journey definitely like unfolds naturally out of the character for me, or I try to make that happen. So usually when I write, I'll start with kind of the bare bones of that. I'll sort of generally know where I'm trying to get to, what I'm thinking about for the ending in broad strokes, but then I'll kind of just start on page one and just give it a go. And I do like a rough vomit pass through the whole script, just, you know, chronologically, like going through the whole thing. It usually ends up being like a very short, simplified version, but and most of it is not stuff that's going to stay in the movie, but it's my way of kind of sort of like letting my subconscious just play and like and just I want to kind of see what'll happen, and then I take a step back and I read through that, and that's when it starts becoming clear like what the movie wants to be. Like rather than imposing some outline and some narrative onto it, I want to see what this kind of project wants to be, and it'll organically kind of tell me like, okay, there seem to be these kind of like thematic connections going on between this and this. Like, I'd like to bolster that. Or like, oh, this character actually ends up being a little more important to the main character than I was expecting. Like, maybe I should bring that out more. Or like, you know, this idea that I had that I thought would be exciting, like it doesn't interest me anymore. Like, I feel like this thing is actually more exciting to me. Then I'll start outlining, where I'll start kind of like, you know, that's sort of when it's not, I mean, it's sort of beyond editing. Like I'm going to almost rewrite the whole thing, but that's when I start really kind of piecing things together and tracking arcs and things like that. I'm not hard and fast about like the 3-act structure or anything like that, but sometimes I'll fall back on that if I want to think about how I'm trying to structure this and what the organization is. I think that can help with kind of macro pacing and things like that. But yeah, I'll start kind of trying to like let the script tell me what it wants to be. And I find that like more fun, and I think it takes it in more unexpected directions and in the directions that I kind of like to explore. I think it ends up being a little less conventional sometimes, but I enjoy that element of it.
When you sit down to write, you give yourself a preference of hours spent in the chair versus pages each day, or is it a combo of both?
In time, I've tried to be a little more forgiving of myself in that, like, a lot of times writing is just watching YouTube videos to research something. And if I don't write a word all day, but I feel like I'm just sort of filling up the well and thinking about it, that's plenty. I mean, sometimes writing is just like playing Zelda Breath of the Wild and trying to like clear your head and kind of connect with like what fundamentally you want to be doing and just trying to not think about writing for a little bit. And then sometimes writing is staying up till 4 a.m. and cranking out 15 pages. And I try to forgive myself for the kind of ebb and flow of that. Like, I tend to be a pretty fast writer overall. When I'm not being super productive, I try to just be like, it's okay. Like, this is your mind telling you that you need to recharge or something isn't clicking yet. And I usually try to wait until something's clicking and I'm like, oh, I got it. Like, I need to dive into this scene. And then again, sometimes you just have to sort of force it and be like, I'm just being lazy. Now I just have to sit down and start writing, and it'll start terrible, but then you'll hit a groove and like something will start coming together. So it's sort of a journey of kind of getting to know yourself and getting to know how you work.
That's interesting. I mean, as you said, you didn't go to film school, and there's no one way to do it. I mean, as William Goldman famously said in his book, Adventures in the Screen Trade, nobody knows anything in Hollywood. And so everybody finds their own way. What do you think helped you when you were starting out as a writer and, working on your first screenplays and then continuing to evolve? Were you, as you were evolving, reading a lot of scripts? Was that something that was kind of feeding you creatively and also allowing you to get a sense of format and structure from other scripts?
Yeah, I mean, I did read scripts. I feel like the thing that I think just being forgiving of yourself, like, writing something terrible just to write something is okay. Like, writing something that you're not sure if you care about it. Like, I think the biggest discovery I feel like I've eventually made that has strengthened me is I have a better sense now of what I care about and what I will want to explore for an extended period of time. Because especially if you're directing something, you have to fall in love with this thing and care about it for years. And like, that's a long time to care about something. So if it's just like a cute idea, it's not going to have the kind of weight in your soul to like carry you through those dark times and those difficult times when people are challenging the idea and you really have to know why you cared about it and what you're trying to achieve. And so like, I think just getting to know myself better was really helpful. And, I look back at, just like stuff I was playing with in my early 20s and I like, in some ways, I'm embarrassed by it. And I'm like, what was I even thinking? Like, I didn't even like that. I didn't even think that was a good idea. I just did it because, someone said that they thought it might sell, or like someone else was excited about it, or like, I thought this is what you were supposed to do. But like, I sort of have to forgive myself for that because I think it was in doing those things and pushing up against the things that don't sort of speak to your soul that you kind of figure out what actually does. So I don't think there's one like right way to do it, but at the end of the day, you want to figure out what you care about and what you love and what you want to pursue. And I think sometimes by doing stuff you don't care about, that is the clearest way to know what actually does speak to you.
I mean, as you said, like in what you were talking about of not being so hard on yourself, some writers become perfectionists and it can stall them because how do you go on to the next page if you're convinced the page that you just wrote doesn't work? And that's the concept of what you were talking about earlier with doing a vomit pass, in which, the concept is don't judge it, just get it all out there. And then you have a document, and like a sculptor, you could continue to revise it. You could continue to perfect it. But until you have a document, you can't do anything. So you got to move forward. And until then, you can't perfect it. But that's cool.
Yeah.
Before we get to Quiet Place Day One, I guess my last big question for you is, what was your biggest lesson coming off of Pig? I saw the movie. I absolutely loved it. We were happy to have you in Backstory Magazine talking about writing and directing it. But now that a little time has passed, what was your biggest lesson on Pig that kind of informed your creative process thereafter?
Yeah, I mean, I think my biggest lesson was, even though I didn't think it was the case, my personality type can work as a director and can rally a crew and can create an environment where people feel heard and it feels like a creative collaboration that everyone can sort of like get on board with. You can be calm and respectful and listen and make a movie, and you don't have to be loud or boisterous or bossy.
Right.
And that it can actually be like a really warm, positive environment. And I think going on to Quiet Place, I was really happy that I was worried that like maybe that wouldn't mesh with like a studio environment, but I found that actually you can still create a sense of camaraderie on set and a real sense of kind of quiet warmth and make people feel like kind of creatively secure and safe and listened to, even on sort of a larger scale. I think weirdly the Quiet Place set still had this kind of indie vibe to it, which was really nice and reassuring to know that, okay, like I can kind of carry that with me, carry the way I like to work with me, no matter the scale of the project.
That's fantastic. Well, I want to get into the details of Quiet Place. I guess the easiest question to ask as our last non-spoiler question would be, what could you tell us about the budget and schedule for Quiet Place Day One?
Yeah, I can tell you I don't know what I'm supposed to say about the budget actually.
Okay.
I've seen some numbers floated around online. Right. That like I'll say those aren't far off if that's useful.
That is.
The schedule, I can tell you, principal was shockingly, it was actually only 40 days, which is not super long for something like this, which is kind of crazy. And we shot it in London in the wintertime, which was also kind of crazy to try and do New York City there. But it was sort of a kind of an amazing challenge, and pulling it off was fun. And I think it opened up some really like interesting creative routes of how to capture the sense of New York that I was really happy with. Yeah, I can tell you it was 2.5 years of my life, and it's crazy to be done with it.
Well, I want to get into it even further. So podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify and YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube channel, which is where all these Zoomcasts go, so you can see us actually talking. If you have not yet seen A Quiet Place Day One, go see it in theaters. And we are now going to get into the spoilers, so you are forewarned. One quick question about that is it's widely known that Jeff Nichols had done a draft of the script and then left for creative differences. This is very common in Hollywood. Jeff is a completely talented writer-director in his own right. It's no big deal that he left this project, but there's always an interesting remnant sometimes that's left when somebody leaves on creative differences that the new writer-director would build on. Was there anything that you found interesting about that draft before you embarked on your own draft?
Yeah, I read that draft. Actually, I spoke to Jeff. He reached out really generously, and just to kind of say like, hey, like don't, like, here was my experience. Don't, like, you make this your own thing, like no hard feelings sort of thing. And he was very gracious about that. And I adore his movies. I just saw The Bike Riders and I thought it was incredible. I think he's super talented. I think he would have done an incredible job with this movie. I read his draft. It was beautifully written. I could totally see him in it. But kind of in the same way, like, I think one of the reasons he kind of left was because he was like, I'm worried this isn't going to be a me movie. I sort of had to just, I had to kind of like throw that out, be like, okay, that was Jeff's draft. It was nice to read. I see what he was doing. It would have been great, but now I need to focus on my characters and my story and kind of start from page one. And it helped because, like, I think the character of Sam was, that character of a hospice patient who's kind of dying and then is faced with the end of the world was very much my into the movie and what I really wanted to explore. And I think that kind of shades everything about the movie. Yeah. And it, some of the things that he was playing with just would not have made any sense for a character going through what Sam's going through. So I think that was part of my way to react to, like, okay, I'm going to get rid of all the, like, families escaping cities, soldiers fighting aliens. Like, none of that really means anything to a hospice patient who's dying and just wants to get her slice of pizza. So that was my way of kind of like insulating myself from that and focusing on a small story that was very much my own.
Well, and it's very character driven, which is just like Pig. And I want to talk about that for a second, because on paper, with working on a documentary, doing short films, doing Pig, you wouldn't be the first candidate that would leap to mind. But Pig was so well performed, so well written, that for a character driven movie like this, which is focused on the microcosm of, you talk character goals, a woman who just wants that last slice of pizza as the world's ending. It's a great hook. What was it like for you to land that job? And what was your early interactions like with John Krasinski? Because he has story by credit on this. And I'm just curious, like, what he pitched to you when you were coming in those meetings.
He reached out to me. He had seen Pig and he really loved it. And he reached out to me and said, "Hey, would you want to bring some of that pig touch to the Quiet Place universe?" And the initial kind of prompt was, we want to do a New York day one invasion movie. It was kind of it came from Quiet Place to Jimon Hansu's character talks about the first day in New York City and people escaping on the boats and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So I think from there they had always been kind of maybe thinking about like, okay, we could sort of explore that story. And there's something inherently exciting about, okay, we're in this sort of rural environment. Now let's go to the urban environment of the noisy city. But beyond that, he was like, what character do you want to follow? What story do you want to do? And he gave me like a week to kind of mull it over. And we were going to touch base after the weekend. And I was really struggling to not feel like I didn't want to make something derivative. I didn't want to make something that felt unnecessary or just sort of prequel for the sake of prequel. So that's why I kind of brushed away all the military, the escaping the city. And then I kind of came to this idea of like, what if our main character wasn't even really trying to survive? I mean, in some ways it made my job much harder because I was kind of kneecapping myself a little bit with, a lot of the tropes of these sorts of movies, you can't really have them in the same way if your character's end goal isn't even like surviving.
Right.
But that was kind of, I was like, that's the only way I could sort of find myself wanting to do something like this without it feeling too tropey or anything. And then I just kind of like fell in love with this character of Sam. I had been reading a book called The Five Invitations that was about someone's experience working in hospice and like the lessons that he saw people learning close to the end of their lives. And I don't know, like her character just kind of became very alive for me. And I became really invested in this story of when the world's falling apart around her, she's kind of got this almost like a superpower that she's already kind of been facing death so much that she can kind of like see through that and focus on something so small and connective. And I think it's something that we all kind of have dealt with a little bit in the pandemic of like, when it feels like the world is sort of falling apart around you, you kind of want to like latch onto those little things of like human connection or connection to things you're passionate about. So it all kind of like unfolded from there. I pitched John that I think my initial pitch was literally a sentence of like, I was thinking about maybe we follow a hospice patient who decides when the world is ending, she just wants to get her last slice of pizza. And I think I might have even opened that pitch with like, I'm not sure if this is the most marketable version of this movie, but like, right, this is my version of a New York day one invasion movie. And his response was, heck yeah, let's do it. And then we brought that to Paramount and then just sort of started like developing it from there. I kind of did my vomit pass thing of, I don't even think I sent them like a treatment of the story. I think I just went off and they gave me kind of space to just crank through the script. And then I moved to New York for a month to kind of steep myself in the environment, just kind of isolated myself a little bit and was just wandering around New York and reading about New York. And I wrote this script and then sent it off to John and his company. We bounced ideas back and forth, sent it to Paramount. Then everyone starts sort of having all these ideas of like, oh, let's make this part bigger. Like, do we need this? And, you start collaborating with the studio.
So wait, I want to stop you there for a second. How long did it take you to get your vomit pass? Like when you went off and did it?
So I think, the vomit pass, no one sees. Like the vomit pass, I write it, then I read it, then I revise it. And then that's like the first draft or like the rough draft that gets sent to the people that need to read that. I think I got that. I don't remember the vomit pass. I remember the first draft. I think I did in like a month and a half or 2 months, maybe. I think I started it in like February 2022. And I think I got it to them like end of March or something like that. And so, yeah, it was a pretty quick process, but they also like, they knew they really wanted to like get into production on this and get things going pretty soon, but it was definitely a quick process. And then, yeah, we were like working on it for a while. I mean, you're kind of working on it. I feel like the film was pretty much, I mean, a lot of what was in that first draft is still the film. Like it was, goes to the city for a puppet show, apocalypse happens. She sort of rejects the classic narratives that she could go down, meets Eric, is going to get pizza. The ending, like very early on, I kind of knew that how we end the movie is how it had to end, with her kind of taking control over her life and death and finding this agency and sort of this like triumphant suicide at the end. I was probably like summer, like July or something. We sort of had the agreed upon version. And then we went out to London in like September to start prepping the movie and then shot it in February 2023. It was a pretty whirlwind process. I mean, it's still like, has been, years of my life, but like there wasn't a lot of like downtime really.
Well, I guess what's interesting is, you're also leveling up as a director. So obviously there was absolutely fine visual language in Pig, but here you're going to be working with previs teams and storyboard artists for big special effects sequences, which is new to your directing. And I'm curious how that influenced you as a storyteller. Because sometimes when, as a writer, even though you've got your draft, these other artists, these really talented crew heads bring in ideas that, juice it along even further. So I'm curious what that process was like for you as a learning curve.
The way I approached Pig and the way I initially approached this was Pat Scola and I, he was the cinematographer on both of these projects. I love him. He's like a brother. I want to work with him on everything. We sit down with the script and we just go through, the two of us, and shot list the whole thing, like pretty specifically. Like we know how we're going to shoot everything, and we have a pretty good shared visual language, so we can describe most of those shots in words and kind of know what we're talking about. Really, we found that previs and storyboards were useful in getting what was in our heads for other people to see, because close up Sam whatever doesn't mean as much to everyone else, who kind of needs to know, like, well, what part of the set are we seeing, and are there going to be VFX in this shot? Do we need special effects? Like, so we found that storyboards were kind of, I wouldn't say that they weren't useful. I would say they were useful for us to communicate to everyone else what we needed to be accomplishing. And we storyboarded a good chunk of the film, but there were also plenty of scenes where we just left it as like, hey guys, here's the shot list. Like, trust us, we're going to do it. And then we didn't do a ton of previs. We did a bit, and that was kind of when when even the storyboards didn't seem to be scratching the itch, when there were still people asking like, wait, but so how long are we doing this? And like, what's going on here? And the studio kind of often wants to know like exactly what something's going to look like. And so then you do some previs. Usually we did previs when it was like more of a technical thing. Like the whole subway sequence was, we were shooting it in this like confined subway set built on a tank, and literally figuring out like, can we fit the crane in and get a shot running all the way down this? How high will we have to? The way we did the subway was to emulate depth. We just made the ceiling able to be raised and lowered, so you could adjust the relative sense of depth of the water based on that. Great. But then it was like, okay, if we have our ceiling at the lowest point for when they submerge underwater, can we get the arm of the crane in? So we did sort of like technical previs stuff, with like literally like putting a physical crane into the previs, so we could see like, okay, we can actually extend to this length and all that stuff. So that was really useful for some of the more like technically demanding sequences, or like the big crowd sequence when there's, cars flipping and a bunch of stunt people and explosions and stuff. That was really helpful to figure out like timing, and just so everyone, when you're doing this massive dance on set of like the actors doing stuff, stunt people doing stuff, special effects people doing stuff, camera people doing stuff, you just need everyone as much on the same page as possible. So, right. So it was really useful in that way.
I'm curious about the lore for a second. When you were, again, meeting with Krasinski and talking about the script, one of the things that he said on Quiet Place 2 that I guess people had suspected was this concept of the Death Angels, which is the name for the aliens, being on meteors that are crashing into Earth, implicating that their homeworld, wherever it was, had exploded, and that they've survived on these meteors and are crashing. And it's not like a UFO-styled invasion. It's just primordial creatures that are able to fare on a meteor via space travel. Was there any more talk about stuff like that was revealed that you could tell us about the lore of these very, basic but dangerous creatures?
We talked a bit about that. I liked the simplicity of that, of like, I feel like people are often saying like, oh, are they like the first wave of some super intelligent alien species? And it's like, no, there's something nice about like, they're almost like a space virus. They were on some planet that was destroyed, and they were so durable that they were cast through space, and just they hit planets that happened to cross their paths as meteorites. And then they are just like these apex predators that we are not ready for. And like, there's something about the simplicity of that I think is one of the best parts of them. I think trying to like over explain them or give them some like further motive beyond just, they're just hunting and living. I dove a little deeper into like, okay, what is their ecosystem? Like, what do they eat? Are they like, the movie wasn't about that for me. Like, there weren't any scenes of scientists being like, we've been dissecting the creature and we found that like, blah, blah, blah. Like, like I really didn't have any interest in that because Sam didn't have any interest in that. I mean, there were times when people suggested like, oh, like what if Eric like relays all the stuff that he's learned about the creatures and their sort of like farm to Sam, and it would just be like, why? Like she would just be like, why are you telling me? Like I'm dying and I'm getting my pizza. Like I don't like it's the end of the world, man. That's all I need to know. So like I kind of tried to like avoid some of that while still hinting at little bits of it. I liked this idea that the creatures were kind of farmers, and I like this idea that it's very like you can almost barely see, but it's implied that they're actually like growing their food out of organic material of like humans' bodies, and the things that they hunt they use as sort of like fodder for their for this stuff that they farm and eat.
Does it have a name? Because some people likened it to the alien eggs in the scene where Eric sees them feeding. And I didn't actually realize that those were being grown in the human bodies, because people have long debated, aside from being predators, are these aliens eating humans or are they doing something else? So you might have answered that question here. Was the concept that basically they're growing food out of their kill?
Yeah. Again, it's like I wasn't trying to put too fine a point on it, but yeah, like if you, for eagle-eyed viewers, you can sort of see that's what's going on. Yeah, it's loosely based on like the idea of leafcutter ants, that they sort of gather organic material in leaves and then they put this like spore on them that then grows out of that organic material and produces the sugars that they eat. So I liked that idea that they had this kind of ecosystem, and like for such violent, scary looking creatures, I liked that they were actually just farmers, and like those big old claws are for opening up these kind of weird mushroom melon things that they eat the insides of, and those sharp teeth, they're not like biting people and tearing them apart with their teeth. That's to eat this sort of like dense kind of fruit thing that they grow. And I don't know, there was something about, especially because the first movie is about a family of farmers. I like this idea that these creatures in their own way were kind of farmers that had a slightly familial dynamic. But all this is sort of like, it's not really important to the characters. So it was all just kind of like a little lore stuff to kind of bury in there that I thought was fun and interesting to me, and gave them still like a primal reason for doing what they're doing. But it's a little less than just like, oh, we're going around eating people. But it was just kind of seeded in there a little bit.
That's great. I really like that concept, and something that's been inherent in the franchise is allowing the audience to kind of catch up to what's going on. There's a cliche of science fiction to have professor exposition. And luckily, as you said, you didn't have that. Now, I got to go for the geekiest screenwriting question of the world here, and I've just been waiting ever since I've seen the movie. In the movie, you have Frodo the cat. Right? It's Sam's cat. She's taking it with her. And as we all know, there's a very famous screenwriting book called Save the Cat by Blake Snyder. And they are literally saving the cat in this movie. Was that an influence on you or just a coincidence?
I mean, I think a little bit of both. I've definitely read Save the Cat. It's like a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek joke of, yes, okay, having a cat there is going to invest you in this. And I think for me, there was something fun about in trying to do something that's like very different for a big budget blockbuster movie, following a dying character that isn't trying to survive, putting like this kind of classic cat in there that has elements of that role was a little bit of, I don't know, there was something kind of fun about pairing something so unexpected with something kind of classic in that way. But then I think the cat sort of takes on a lot of various meanings throughout the story and becomes kind of a bit of a symbol for like the connection between Sam and her past, and then Sam and Eric. But yeah, there's definitely an edge of that.
I'd read somewhere that Lupita had a fear of felines.
Terrified. She was terrified of them.
You needed a cat psychiatrist or psychologist or something like that for her? Or
I don't think so. I think
is that bogus?
She was terrified of cats. I think she had like a bad cat experience as a kid.
Right.
And she really was afraid to even touch the cats initially. So our first meeting with the cats was my office. We were sitting on the floor. The animal trainer brought Schnitzel in. Schnitzel played Frodo. And Lupita spent like 10 minutes kind of like crawling across the floor, like touching the cat, getting a little closer, touching the cat, eventually petting it. And after like an hour, eventually she like picked it up. And then every day before shooting, in prep, she would go in and spend like an hour with the cats and the trainers and kind of acclimate herself to them. And it was really brave of her. Like she was really terrified of cats. Like it wasn't a jokey, like, oh, I don't really like cats. Right. Like she really was frightened of them. And she knew not only did she have to be able to kind of handle them and from like a practical standpoint, be comfortable enough with them, but she had to look like she loved this cat and had known it for years. So she really put in the time. And yeah, over the course of the shoot, she really fell in love with those cats and cats in general. And now she has a cat of her own named Yo-Yo. And we just did our first play date with my cat and her cat. That was a big transformation for her.
I'm curious, did she ever ask you to rewrite the cat? Because somewhere I read that she said, is there anything else we could do and not make it a cat?
I read that as well. Someone asked me about that. And like, I don't have as strong of a memory of that. I think it might have been more of like, really, does it have to be a cat? And, and we talked about that of, can't really be a dog. A dog would not do well in the quiet place world. And a cat has this real kind of, it's anchored in sort of New York, like the idea of like street cats and bodega cats.
Right.
It's kind of part of the fabric of New York. So we definitely talked about that, but I think she kind of got why the cat made the most sense.
It was also a surprisingly silent cat. And I was curious, have you ever had anything in there where the cat does something like by, meowing or hissing at the death angels that got it in further trouble? Or was it just a well-behaved cat that knew maybe it needs to remain chill because the world's kind of ending?
It was a pretty well-behaved cat. I didn't want to lean too much on, oh, cat makes a noise, then they get chased. Cat makes a noise. Like I thought,
right.
Then you would start questioning, like, just leave your cat behind, Sam. Like, this is just getting annoying. So, you want to be careful not to go too far in that direction. But also, like, in my mind, cats can be very silent predators that are known for being extremely sneaky. And if they don't want to make noises, they don't have to make noises. I mean, they hunt mice and like they can be very quiet. And I also read a study about how a lot of meowing is actually like a learned behavior that they use to communicate with humans, and that naturally they're actually even more silent, and they don't do a lot of that sort of meowing is them saying like, oh, feed me. I want you to like, give me stuff, like give me cuddles. So I think like we're used to the kind of domesticated version of cats, but especially if Frodo was like a street smart New York street cat who maybe Sam like brought in and he became her pet. Like I like this idea that like, he knows what's up, and he knows that like, okay, there's scary monsters, and kind of getting the feeling that they hunt by sound, like predators know predators. And I figured they'd do okay. I know it requires a little bit of stretching belief, but like, I don't know, it didn't seem that impossible or implausible to me.
No, it worked, and I liked having Frodo hunt a mouse in the middle of the movie. That was good too, just to show the whole predator and prey of, on a smaller scale. But look, I am allergic to cats, and I'm convinced that they were sent here as an alien race to destroy us. So you can't talk me out of it, but that's
I think there's science
movie.
Behind that. I think you might be right.
There's a lot of science behind it. Ooh, hey, I'm jumping in really quick to remind you to check out Backstory Magazine. We just turned 12 this summer and also published issue 52, so the summer is off to a great start. If you've never read us before, you could always read us on a desktop or laptop or via our iPad app, Backstory. And of course, you could read the free issue. And if you like what you see, and I hope that you do, you could use discount coupon code SAVE5. That's SAVE and the number 5, and that will save you $5 off a 1-year subscription. The fun thing about Backstory is that even though we've already published issue 52, we keep adding new articles and new scripts to the magazine, so there's always something new to read. You could always check out our table of contents at backstory.net to see what's inside each issue. But look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where all these Zoomcasts go. It would really mean a lot to me to have you become a subscriber, so thanks for considering. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right back into our interview with writer-director Michael Sarnoski about his latest film, A Quiet Place, Day One. Well, so, what's always interesting to hear in the development process are left turns. So I'm curious early on if there was an idea that you had that made it to the page that never made it off the page. So I'm not even talking about a deleted scene that you shot, but an idea where maybe a day, a week, a month, you guys were thinking of doing something that ultimately was never even shot, but seemed like a really good idea at the time, because it's fun hearing about those discarded ideas that lead you on the path toward the final film.
That's a great question. I mean, a lot of them, you kind of end up seeing where they found their way into like another part of the film or things like that. Like I remember initially when Eric does go to kind of that creature farm, that happened in a very different place in the film. And it was originally supposed to be in Central Park. And I didn't play it for scares. Like I played it as they kind of stumble across this massive farm where they're watching these creatures kind of in their ecosystem. And I wanted to play it more for like the kind of awe and beauty of the moment, and just sort of like, oh wow, like these things that we've been terrified of this whole time, like they actually, like there's something kind of incredible and otherworldly and beautiful about them. And I think for like cost purposes and for like we're making scary stuff, not awe beautiful stuff. That kind of got like sidelined for a while. Actually, it's kind of complicated. Like at one point, the thing that Eric was going to do when he went to the pharmacy was that I liked the idea of sort of those images of New York City after the hurricanes when the streets were flooded, and I liked the idea of him having to sort of traverse a flooded street and then a part of a street that had sort of collapsed into the subway, and it had turned into like a rushing water, and he had to like get across that to get to the pharmacy. But for like budget reasons and various things, we couldn't do that. So then that sort of became the subway scene that was earlier. So then I still needed like a thing for him to kind of overcome when going to the pharmacy. So then it was kind of like, oh, like maybe we can repurpose that idea of the alien farm as something that he has to kind of like traverse in this moment, and turn it into more of like a scary thing. I guess that's not exactly answering the question, but it does show how some of these ideas get sort of left behind for a while and then maybe repurposed in different ways.
Yeah, it totally answers it. You know, something that's interesting about this is because it's a sequel, you're greenlit. Like you're not having to really try with your draft to get the studio to make your film. And one of the things that a lot of writers have difficulty with is action on the page. Because if you describe it in chunks that are too long paragraphs, even though it's interesting, readers sometimes lose interest. Now, you're safe here again because this was a guaranteed shoot. Like, you know what you're going to make. But what did you learn about writing action on the page? Because some writers try and take a staccato approach of maybe it's a line of action and then a white space. And, you know, the more white space, the quicker the eye could move rather than a blocky paragraph. Was that something that you wrestled with at all?
I had never really done this before, but I did play with like formatting and sizing of text and bold, and like for things like, especially for things like sounds, and you know, oftentimes there's going to be a bunch of action and then some sound is going to set things off, and I would make that bigger and bolder and centered, or I would play with kind of the formatting a bit. I didn't want to go too far because sometimes that can get a little hokey, but like I did play with that. I try to keep it pretty simple and straightforward. Like some writers very much like tell the audience like how they're supposed to feel and all that stuff. And I try to avoid that and just kind of be bare bones of like, here's what you're going to see. And like, if you're not sort of feeling it from thinking about what you're going to see, me telling you that you're excited isn't like, that's a cheat sort of.
Right.
Sometimes you got to cheat a little bit just to let people know sort of like the energy that you want in a certain moment. But like, I try to keep it like pretty straightforward so that people can really clearly see like what the important things are. But no, it's tricky to write like extensive, complicated action scenes. And at a certain point, you just kind of have to like know that like, hey, you're just going to have to use your imagination and think about how this could be exciting, because reading a page of some crazy crowd attack is never going to be quite the same as experiencing it. So you just sort of do your best, but also know that like, you know, there's a reason that audiences don't sit in groups of 300 and just watch the screenplay go by. Like screenplays are incredible and they have to conjure a feeling, but they're also at the end of the day a blueprint for something beyond that.
Absolutely. You know, it's interesting for character goals. Obviously, Sam's goal is to get the slice of pizza. And as we later learn, which we'll talk about in a second, it's relating to her childhood and a final connection that she wants to make in the city. What could you tell us about Eric's goal? I mean, really, the interesting thing about the Quiet Place series is because they can't talk, the concept of exposition generally is lost. And there's been a way in each movie where people can speak, but it's mostly silent. And it seems to me on the surface, really, Eric's concept goal is really just survival. And he's happy to have a connection with another person that he thinks could lead him around the city because he's British and she knows the city better. Tell us about Eric's goal and also the excellent introduction of him literally swimming up and popping up above a subway staircase that, you know, in an instant tells you, oh my God, the subways are flooded. Of course, there's a lot of bad things he's gotten to just to make it to this moment when we meet him, which again is an interesting little thing. You say a lot by just showing a little.
For him, not to go back to the sort of dog stuff, but if Sam is like a dog trying to curl up under a porch to die, Eric is kind of a lost puppy. I think in some ways his goal is to like find a goal. I think he's found Sam, who he sees as this sort of campfire in the storm. And he's so shocked and traumatized and horrified by what's going on around him, that he sort of doesn't know what to do, and he's just looking for some sense of safety with this person. And then he sort of has to learn to, not put his entire life onto someone else, and he's going to have to take responsibility for himself if he wants to survive. I wanted him to kind of feel like he does get sort of plopped in halfway through the movie at like a really sort of weird time, narratively speaking. Like it's pretty odd to like introduce a main character just all of a sudden like that in the middle of the movie. But I sort of wanted the audience to feel a little bit like how Sam's feeling of like, what are you doing in my movie? Like I'm taking a quiet, soulful journey to get my last slice of pizza. Like, where did you come from and why are you following me? Leave me alone. Like, you're supposed to be in some other movie. And so I think the like suddenness of his arrival and sort of feeling like you both meet him a little bit in the middle of his story and also plop him into her story in the middle of it. I kind of wanted it to feel a little jarring and like a little like this doesn't seem like a normal thing to do in a movie like this. But that's kind of how our characters are feeling. So I think that hopefully captures that.
There's an old trope in horror movies of people are racing under a bed to escape a monster and one of them gets dragged away. It's just become a staple of the genre. You kind of mixed it up here in which, one of the things that the series has been good on is kind of zooming in on kind of macro tiny moments. And when Sam is hiding under the car, yes, aliens are dragging someone else away and she's safe for the moment, but you have a tire start deflating. And it was just a very simple, I would say, commend you, low budget, exciting thing to do of, is she going to be able to get out of there before the car falls on her? Tell us about when that idea came about, because I thought it was very effective.
So, I mean, I think in general, it's like it can get a little monotonous. I mean, especially on the third movie in this franchise, it's like, okay, you make a sound, something kills you. Like, yes, that's sort of scary at its core, but like, you don't want every single thing to be that. And
Right.
You want to sort of like find ways to like find some interesting stakes within a scene. And I think a lot of it comes from like sort of the playground of New York City of like, what are all the different options for the weird situations we could get people into, and the jungle gym of stuff they have to kind of get through, the flooded subways and yeah, the car thing was, I think there was I had a scene where, yeah, she is under the car, someone grabs her, and then the car gets crunched down and her foot gets stuck and she has to like really rip her foot out. I think that might actually have been a John suggestion where he was like, you should make it that the car's like hissing and sinking down as well to like up it even more. Like, so before it was just kind of this like, oh God, I think there's like fire all around and she just had to get out. But that little like tire hiss thing kind of took it up to another level. I think that might have been his suggestion. This is digging back like 2 years. But yeah, it's just one of those like, you find this kind of small contained thing and figure out, okay, so she's stuck. So there's fire. So there's creatures all around. What else can we do to kind of amp it up and put like a sort of time limit on it? And that's sort of the same thing for everything. It's like, okay, you're in a subway, subway's flooded. Okay, subway's flooded. There's a creature on the ceiling. Okay, like not only that, but like now the current's going so fast that you can't swim back, and like you just kind of are always kind of finding those things that are one more obstacle in the way.
I mean, it was very effective. It was a great thing. One of the things that was interesting to see is Jaimin Hansu was here. He plays Henry in the second film, as we talked about. And Henry has this monologue in the second film about day one, talking about there were 10 boats and only 2 made it out. And, it's a very emotional monologue for him in the second film. And here, when you're flashing back and seeing him on one of the boats, obviously, was there ever any thoughts of showing that? And technically, because the lore is already out there, it would be redundant to show it. I do agree with that. But yeah, I could see it being very tempting as an action sequence to show the ships launching and the ones that are failing.
There were conversations about that. I mean, one of the things I'm kind of doing with Jimon's character is that I'm presenting him as like, the movie could go that way. Like, you could follow him, you could follow the family trying to escape. It would be good, it would be compelling, but like, that's not Sam's story. So yeah, you kind of use him as like a bit of like a benchmark for like what could have been. So, you kind of feel like that story is happening like in the background. Like, when it's that we do sort of see the boats, we hear about the boats from Sam's perspective, but that's not her goal and that's not what she's trying to accomplish. So it would be weird to cut back to them and follow a different story. That's not our main story. And, that was a sticking point with the studio and stuff. And like, some people wanted to be like, no, but we have to like fulfill this promise of this story. And it's like, yeah, but that's not the story we're telling. That's a different story. And it was like, we talked a lot about it. Like, is there a way to, how do we make people feel like we've scratched that itch enough? And for me, it was kind of baking it into Sam's story enough that you sort of get the sense that it's happening behind the scenes, and you sort of see the result of it when you find Jaimin on the boat at the end. But yeah, I was sort of trying to feel like some of those promises were happening off screen. But that was the thing we kind of dealt with in general, was like, you know, it's that same idea of people are like, oh, we want to see how everyone figured out the rules. And it's like,
Right.
you do, but you don't. Like, you want, like, you already know the rules. And if you spend an hour showing people learning the rules, eventually you're going to be like, why do we have to see people learning the rules again? Like, it's always like, you want to find just the right amount to give people that they feel like they're getting that sort of itch scratched, and they're getting to enjoy what they want to see, but it's not getting redundant, and you're not seeing
Yeah.
stuff that you already know.
Did it very economically, actually, because when she passes out from the explosion, by the time she wakes up, she's already in the theater. She's back in the theater, and she's noticing everybody being quiet, and she kind of has to figure out why they're being quiet, because, so she's at least learning that rule after, being passed out, that, it's sound.
Yeah.
It seems like they're not even aware on day one that there's a blindness factor for the aliens. And I don't even think that there needs to be an awareness of that, because really sound is the main thing that propels. Editing is the last stage of storytelling. There was one thing I noticed in the trailer. Somebody is dying that's not Ruben shutting off a generator. And this is very common because trailers are made when films are still in their final edit. What could you tell us about that moment, which was just a moment where Ruben from Hospice is turning off the generator to try and save people, and he gets killed because he rips his shirt.
That was an idea that came in. We did some additional photography on it, and that was, it was basically like, we had that moment with a different character. Originally, it was the puppeteer, actually, from the puppet show. Yeah, there was kind of this idea of, the plan was to keep Ruben alive, and he was going to be on the boat at the end of the movie. But he, Alex did such an incredible job with the performance that there was this conversation about, like, he's such a wonderful character that if we killed him here, it would hit very hard. It would be that kind of feeling of like, no one's safe if Ruben's not safe. And that was one of those ideas that sort of, you end up sort of fusing a couple things and doing a variation on something that ends up being like really emotional. I think it works well in the film. But yeah, it was sort of it was a later stage decision.
Yeah, and it's good for stakes, obviously, to do that as well. Was there anything else that was deleted that you want to tell us about that might end up on a Blu-ray one day that maybe was redundant or just needed to go?
There are lots of different things that you just sort of naturally in, like, I think the director's cut of this, like, before we started, kind of when it was kind of just everything, I think it was like 2.5 hours or something. Like, there was just a lot in it, and you just kind of have to get more economical, and you're always going to kind of shave it down. There used to be an apartment scene that was like twice as long that we really like tightened up because, I kind of loved it, and it was sort of beautiful and had a lot of like wonderful character moments. But, it was just finding that balance of like, okay, like things are slowing down a little too much here. We got to keep the energy up, but like we still want to have the emotional moment. There was some more to Eric's backstory. There was like a longer conversation about kind of what he was going through. That I think that one actually is going to be on the deleted scenes on the DVD, because it sort of exists within the movie. But yeah, it gets into sort of what brought him to the city more deeply, and what the city kind of meant to him, and kind of what he was doing in the subway on the morning of. That was one I sort of missed, because I think it gave a lot of depth to his character. But it was one of those, like, there was something about like the silence of his character and sort of wondering about that was nice. But yeah, there was some like a little more character stuff. I don't know. There were lots of little things, but a lot of it's in service to sort of like the larger pace of the film, that like, it would be nice to kind of explore some of this stuff, but we have to kind of get this thing moving. And it's always that juggling of like, high energy, tense action stuff and quiet character moments. And you sort of need both of those, but they need to be in just the right balance.
Sam's ending of listening to Nina Simone's Feeling Good and then taking the headphones off and letting the radio play. And, she's going out in her chosen way rather than letting the aliens choose. What other ending ideas did you play with, or was it always that?
That was always kind of what I wanted it to be. And I never really wanted it to feel like a sacrifice. Like it was important to me that like Eric's safe and like
Right.
he made it.
He's
And
away.
this is just her. This is just her in her city, kind of living again in a way that she didn't think she'd have the opportunity to. I mean, there were definitely conversations down the line of like, oh, wouldn't it be more conventional to like make it that she's sacrificing herself to save Eric and all that stuff, and that'll get more of that cheer and all that stuff. But like, it just didn't feel true to her story and like what she was going through. Like, this was a lot of this movie is about her relationship to death and how that sort of relationship becomes expressed outward in the world around her, and how she's grappling with that, and she transitions from sort of like anger and bitterness to a kind of like an empowerment over that. And so like it sort of had to be on her terms for herself, and to have that sort of triumphant feeling that I wanted.
When it comes down to it, what would you say was your toughest scene, both as a writer and a director? So the scene that you kept coming back to over and over again on the page, and how you creatively rose to the challenge, and then your toughest scene on set as a director.
Yeah, I mean, toughest scene on set was definitely the subway scene. Just like it's, I love that scene, but it's just really hard to shoot in rushing water with a cat and like in a confined environment. And it was just really, really hard. I mean, and we kind of knew it was going to be really hard. You don't write something like that saying like, oh, that'll be a breeze. Like it was one of those, like we sort of put it in the middle of the schedule. So we had sort of ramped up to the point where we could pull that off. But that was definitely hard. And I'm sure the actors would say that was, you know, dragging them along on cables, rushing through the water and all that stuff. Like that was really difficult. Toughest scene on the page to write. That's a good question. I mean, in some ways it was the toughest, but also kind of one of the more gratifying. But like that middle apartment scene when they're sitting and they read the poem and scream with the thunder, like that, finding just that right balance of connection between two characters that don't know each other that well, and finding sort of like a beauty after you've seen a lot of really difficult stuff. That was like finding just that right balance was really tricky, but like exciting. Like it felt natural and it came together naturally, but it was hitting that specific tone where like you could sort of be moved in spite of everything you'd sort of seen and all the craziness by just like a quiet scene of two characters reading a poem together. That was a tricky balance to hit.
Yeah, and it's character driven. So I mean, like you want to get it right, and it's one of the few times that they could speak in the movie. So
Yeah.
you know, it's kind of the respite from the tension horror that's going on. For your first sci-fi action movie, you really knocked it out of the park, and I can't wait to see what you do next. What is next? I know that there is something listed that I read called The Death of Robin Hood. Is that real, or is that just the internet being crazy?
That is a script I actually wrote it right when I got the job for Quiet Place. Right before I started writing Quiet Place, I kind of made a deal with myself that if I'm going to go on to a big studio movie, I want to have my kind of passion project in the wings and have something that I really care about. And I've been thinking about that script for a while. It was similar to Pig in that, like, I think I like to do movies that on paper could sound like a crazy idea, like a movie about a truffle hunter with his pig, or a movie about a dying person getting pizza that's supposed to be a big summer blockbuster. And Robin Hood was kind of the same thing, where it's like, you know, we've had a lot of Robin Hood movies, and people could kind of be like, oh, do we really need another Robin Hood movie? And I had this particular angle on it that I really wanted to explore. And I took a crack at it, fell in love with the script, and I was like, I've got to make this movie. So that sort of became my next one. We've been kind of working on it in the wings, and we've got Hugh Jackman on board as Robin, and Jodie Comer's in it. And yeah, we're going to go shoot that beginning of next year. So I'm going to take a little breather and then dive into that. And that's sort of, you know, I made a really small movie with Pig, a big movie with Quiet Place. And Robin is kind of my right in between, where I can sort of use everything I learned on either side of that and try and really, like, I don't know, kind of do something that's very me.
Are you returning to the questioning one's mortality like you did in Day One? Is The Death of Robin Hood about Robin Hood trying to find his successor, knowing that his rich life is coming to an end? Is that kind of the vibe?
It's not exactly that, but there's definitely a lot of questioning mortality, and there's a lot of death in it. It's got some really violent stuff in it, but it's also got some very like quiet, nuanced, heartfelt stuff. And yeah, I don't want to spoil too much about it, but
sure.
I definitely think it's kind of a Robin Hood story that you've never seen before. And yeah, I think it's gonna kind of scratch a lot of itches that people didn't realize they had about that character, and do something pretty beautiful with it.
Well, congrats on your first summer blockbuster. I had a blast watching it in theaters, and I'm psyched to see what you do next. Michael, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much. It's great.
And that's how the Q&A went down. Special thanks again to writer-director Michael Sarnoski for being so generous with his time and coming down to chat about his latest film, A Quiet Place, Day One. And folks, while you're surfing around online, I hope you also check out Backstory Magazine. If you've never read us before, there's a free issue waiting for you. You could read it on a desktop or laptop or via our iPad app, Backstory. And if you like what you see, and I hope that you do, you could use discount coupon code SAVE5 to save $5 off a 1-year subscription. So look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where you could see all these Zoomcasts come to life. That's right, you could watch us discuss these things. It would really mean a lot to me to have you become a subscriber, so thanks for considering. The Q&A with Jeff Goldsmith podcast is a copyright of Unlikely Films Incorporated in 2024. All rights reserved. And folks, if you ever want to reach out, feel free to drop me a line at backstoryletters@gmail.com. You can also find me on social media as Yo Goldsmith on Twitter or backstory_mag on Twitter. Those same handles also work on Instagram. I'm Yo Goldsmith on Instagram or backstory_mag on Instagram. And I also have a Facebook fan page. So if you want to get a hold of me, there's plenty of ways to drop me a line. I'm Jeff Goldsmith, the publisher of Backstory Magazine and the host of the Q&A. Thanking you for tuning in and telling you to stay out of trouble. Till next week.